In the SEC, it is still Texas A&M on top of the conference right now. They are undefeated in conference play, 4-0. LSU not far behind at 3-0, and those two teams play each other this week. That should be an incredible game in Kyle Field. I'm really looking forward to it. We'll have a lot more on that later in the picks section, but should be an incredible game. LSU and A&M both control their own destiny at this point, and I think they still both control their own destiny no matter who loses this game. LSU has a difficult schedule the rest of the way out. If they win out, they're definitely into the conference championship game, I would assume. And Texas A&M has a very easy schedule outside of this game, other than their last game of the year, which is hosting Texas. And we've seen now Texas is vulnerable. That's going to be a huge rivalry game. So A&M, I think, will be just fine, even if they lose this weekend. Next up, there's kind of a clump of Georgia, Tennessee, Missouri, Texas, Vanderbilt, all 2-1 in the conference. Or excuse me, Georgia, Tennessee, 4-1, 3-1. The others are 2-1 in the conference. But those teams, I think, also all control their destiny still to this point. Tennessee, if they win out, they're definitely the conference title game. I doubt Missouri wins out at this point. They've really looked susceptible to upsets. Even Auburn this past weekend, and Auburn is not a good football team. So Missouri, I don't see them making it there, but they technically still control their own destiny. Georgia, we know what Georgia is. If they went out, they're in. They look like an incredible football team right now. Obviously, Texas, if they went out, they would only have the one conference loss. They do get A&M at the end of the year, although they do get Vandy this week, and Vandy been sneaky this year, so you never know what's going to happen with them. Then Alabama is the first weird one for me, where I'm not quite sure what the rest of the season holds for them. Not a hugely difficult schedule. They do get LSU, but I think Missouri's really down. Obviously, the Iron Bowl shouldn't be too hard for them this year. Auburn's been horrific, but I think if Alabama wins out, they're still going to need some help to make it into the conference title game and maybe even the playoff. I doubt the committee would leave out an Alabama team if they only have 2 losses, just because that's how these things work usually, but I would still be a little bit uncomfortable if I was in the Crimson Tide's position right now. Then Arkansas and Florida, both also at 2-2 in the conference, and on very different trajectories. Arkansas kind of down right now. The ankle injury to Jaquindon Jackson is very disheartening for Arkansas fans. The quarterback spot with Taylon Green, he played okay, but what is the real ceiling of this team? I'm not sure. Landon Jackson's fun off the edge on the defensive side, but I just don't know how much you can really get from this team down the stretch. Now, on the other hand, with Florida, how about the dynamite freshman for the Gators this past week in the game versus Kentucky? Jaden Ball, hashtag run the ball if you're a Florida fan. 5 touchdowns, tied the Florida rushing touchdown record in a single game with Trey Burton back when he did that, and that's pretty exciting. DJ Lagway, too, was throwing absolute bombs, only a 50% completion percentage, but who cares about completion percentage if you're throwing bombs? The interception, obviously not great, and no touchdowns. That's because Jaden Ball had 5. So, really encouraged by the Florida performance this weekend. This team has not quit on Coach Billy Napier, despite a lot of the fan base having doing so, and I think that's a real testament to his abilities as a leader, even if he can struggle to call plays at times. Then South Carolina sits at 2-3 in the conference. They just beat up on Oklahoma. Oklahoma's terrible. They have no offensive identity. South Carolina still has the great edge duo of Kyle Kennard and Dylan Stewart, and the problem for South Carolina is their schedule the rest of the way. They still have Clemson on the docket. It's not a favorable schedule for the Gamecocks. Lenore Sellers is solid at least. I think this team will really improve next year as well, as Dylan Stewart will improve, Lenore Sellers will improve. I think this team's going to experience some growth, but as far as this year, you're average, and I think that South Carolina fans would honestly take that going into this year with how down a lot of people were on that team, but then the basement of the conference, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Auburn, and Mississippi State, and technically Ole Miss as well. They're 1-2 in the conference. They're not great, so I expect Ole Miss to rise back up through there. I don't think they're playoff material anymore at this point, but the rest of this conference mess down at the bottom, Kentucky, not really any offensive identity. Auburn kind of has an offensive identity, but that identity is turning the football over, and that's not really something you want to do ever. Mississippi State, weirdly, I think has the most upside of any of these teams. Michael Van Buren has looked very solid over the last couple weeks. This team has played Georgia close. They played Texas A&M close. I think they might give some team a shock later down the schedule this year. And then for Oklahoma, I mentioned the complete lack of offensive identity. They're really going to struggle to win games, I think. But as far as the playoffs go for SEC teams, I think that Texas and Georgia and honestly maybe LSU as well are all sitting really pretty right now as far as making it in. LSU, the only reason I hesitate slightly is because of the rest of their schedule. I would say A&M also looks very good to make it into the playoffs. Tennessee, I'm nervous about because you still have to play Georgia. I think that might be another loss for the Volunteers, especially having to play that game in Sanford Stadium, but we'll see what they can do with that. I think Missouri is not a playoff team this year. Alabama, like I said earlier, right on the fringe. And then Vanderbilt, technically, Vanderbilt controls their own destiny. If they win out, they're in the SEC championship game in all likelihood, and then would probably be a playoff team, but I think that one, that doesn't happen, and two, even if they were in the mix, the Georgia State loss would really hurt their at-large resume. Some games later in the SEC this week, Texas travels to Vanderbilt, potential upset there. I know everyone's going to be saying, I think Texas is able to get that done. Obviously, the big game, LSU versus Texas A&M, hugely important for seeding at the top of the conference and who's in the best place to go to Atlanta. Missouri at Alabama, this game I think is going to be weird. Missouri's susceptible to the two things Alabama is really good at, which is running the ball and explosive plays, so I'd be worried if I was a Missouri fan. Arkansas, Mississippi State, I think is an under-the-radar fun game. If you, for some reason, aren't interested in anything else going on Saturday, I would flip that game on. I think it'll be entertaining for sure. Oklahoma, Ole Miss is going to be please don't see TV because Oklahoma cannot move the ball, and Ole Miss has a tendency to struggle versus these lower-tier opponents sometimes, as you saw with Kentucky. But that is it for your SEC breakdown this week.